So good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Ksenia. I'm the project manager of TRUEDEM. Abbreviation TRUEDEM stands for Trust in European Democracies. It's a 3-year research project implemented with the support of the Horizon Europe program of the European Commission. In this project, we aim to collect evidence on the perceptions of trust and judgments of trustworthiness in a range of European countries, and also to develop toolbox of short-term and long-term policy interventions for enhancing trust in political institutions, boosting transparency and inclusiveness of representative systems in Europe. Our today's webinar is part of the TRUEDEM's new initiative. It's called an Observatory on Political Trust Research. And this observatory is designed as a hub of political trust data, publication, news, announcements. Within this observatory, we plan a series of monthly webinars. And in these webinars, both TRUEDEM researchers or, as today, our invited guests will share their research on political trust. And you're, of course, most welcome to comment and to debate on the results. This webinar is the second one in this series. We met already last week to discuss the education bias and political trust. The video from the previous webinar is available at the project website and also at our YouTube channel. So if you missed it, you are most welcome to watch it. For our today's session, we are very happy to have with us Andrew Dawson, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the Glendon campus of York University. Andrew is a member of postgraduate program in Sociology and the Masters in Public and International Affairs program and an Associate Editor of the Canadian Review of Sociology. He completed his PhD in Sociology at McGill University, followed by a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Montreal. In 2019 and 20, he was a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto. Andrew's primary areas of interest include political sociology, violence and development, with a focus on state legitimacy, political and social trust, democracy, and the rule of law. His research was published in various sociology and social science journals, including the British Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, Social Science History, World Development and Nationalism, and Ethnic Politics. Andrew, the floor is yours. You are welcome to share your screen. We will stay today for about 60 minutes or 1 hour. I invite all colleagues to prepare your questions and your comments. You can also use the chat to put your texts, and we'll discuss those at the end. Or you're also most welcome to raise your hand during the Q&A, and then you can speak, and Andrew will be invited to defend his statements. So Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So you can all hear me and see my slides, I presume? Okay, great. So first off, thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar series. I'd like to start with acknowledging my RA and co-author, Isabel Krakow, who's not here today, but contributed to the research that I will be presenting. So I'll start with a little bit of background of how I came to this topic. So I came to political trust via my interest in state legitimacy, and particularly attempts to try to measure and operationalize state legitimacy, which is no easy task. In a prior paper, I looked at the correlates of state legitimacy, and I saw, using some measures of political trust, I found a negative correlation between political trust and democracy. And I also saw that this was consistent with the literature, that others have found this negative correlation between trust and democracy. However, I noticed in the literature that there were a few different interpretations or explanations of this negative correlation between the two. And they more or less revolved around 3 different lines of thinking. The first was that this negative correlation between state legitimacy and, political trust and democracy, I should say, that this negative correlation between those 2 variables is simply an accurate reflection of respondents' views, right? So this is an accurate reflection of reality. It's consistent with the critical citizens thesis in that in societies where citizens are able to exercise their democratic rights, they can publicly criticize and challenge the government and state institutions and so on. And political trust would be expected to be comparatively lower in those countries versus those in which there are limits placed on the freedom of expression, There may be some stringent controls on media and other information. So this limits access to dissenting voices, limits critical news, negative news of governments and state institutions, and so on. So in those countries, we would expect political trust to be higher because of these limits on freedom of expression, right? So in general, the first line of thinking is that this negative correlation between political trust and democracy is essentially simply an accurate reflection of society or actual reflection of reality. Another line of thinking suggests that this negative correlation may be a result of model misspecification, right? So a lot of the empirical research that looked at the relationship empirically between political trust and democracy was often of a bivariate nature. So it often did not include controls, and very rarely did it include a comprehensive suite of controls at both the individual and country level. So the thinking goes with this, with this sort of line of thinking, the thinking goes that, well, if proper controls are simply introduced, if a comprehensive suite of controls are introduced, either this negative correlation will go away, or at a minimum, this negative correlation would become less pronounced, right? So it's somewhat of a statistical artifact, if you will. And the third line of thinking that I've came across in the research is that this negative correlation is simply driven by response bias, right? So this is the idea that there is preference falsification among citizens in non-democratic countries that do not tolerate expressions of dissent, and therefore the respondents will self-censor due to fear of reprisals and indicate that they have higher levels of trust in various political institutions than they actually do, right? So therefore bias is really driving this negative correlation between political trust and democracy. So, I found this quite fascinating. So I decided to take a deeper dive into this relationship. So what I'm presenting today is basically the paper that resulted from that deeper dive that was recently published in Democratization. Okay, so let's make sure I can move my slide ahead. Okay, there we go. So by way of introduction, scholars have long recognized political trust as crucial for the effective exercise of authority. Low political trust, at least in some democracies, has coincided with increasing political polarization, disinformation, voter suppression, the rise of anti-system parties. And these phenomena, in turn, have led to a weakening of both democratic norms and, as some suggest, a weakening of support for democracy. So while these trends suggest a potential connection between low political trust and democratic instability and backsliding, it's unclear whether there's a direct link between the two. So in that spirit, so to speak, the primary objective of the research I'm presenting today is to empirically explore the connection between democracy and political trust. So I do so by drawing upon cross-national time series data from the World Value Survey, the European Value Study, and a variety of other sources. And one of the specific objectives is to assess the extent to which democracy is related to or predicts political trust. So few scholars have conducted empirical analyses of political trust across regime types with a critical mass of autocratic or non-democratic regimes, for reasons I'll get into in a moment. And also, very few have looked at this sort of relationship, attempting to control for response bias. Secondly, until recently, political trust was widely considered a single underlying factor. However, recent research suggests that there are both theoretical and empirical reasons to disaggregate political trust. Therefore, this study compares political trust across partisan and non-partisan political institutions and across regime types. Okay. So the findings, in short, suggest that democracy is strongly, negatively, and robustly associated with political trust across all political institutions, both partisan and non-partisan, and this has some implications which I'll get to later. So when we look at the literature is divided on the relationship between the political trust and democracy. And generally, the literature can be classified into three broad perspectives. The first is what we're calling the high trust perspective. And according to this perspective, democracies are thought to require high levels of political trust, the absence of which leads to democratic crisis and instability. The second perspective is essentially the opposite, if you will, what we're calling the low trust perspective, or if you will, the critical citizens perspective. And here, low levels of political trust are considered a sign of a healthy democracy. Okay, so this perspective therefore recognizes that political distrust plays an important role in democracies without necessarily threatening the political system. The third perspective is what we're calling the bifurcated trust perspective. So this is essentially the middle ground that some scholars take by acknowledging that political trust and distrust are essential for democracies. So that is, while widespread distrust is considered detrimental for democracy, some distrust may actually be healthy or even ideal. So Warren, for example, contends that in well-functioning democracies, those policies contain and channel distrust into the more partisan political institutions, such as the elected executive, the legislature, to keep distrust from generalizing to non-partisan political institutions responsible for the provision of public goods, such as the civil service, the police, and the judiciary. So accordingly, Warren proposes what we're calling the bifurcated trust perspective and suggests that in democracies, one would expect lower trust in partisan institutions and higher trust in non-partisan institutions. So those are the three overarching perspectives. However, Pippa Norris's recent work looking at the freedom of expression in open and closed societies proposes a moderating variable, which I think is quite interesting. And we actually don't get to this in the paper, but I do have some preliminary bonus analyses that I'll offer today for today's talk. So here, the idea is open societies, that is societies that allow for the freedom of expression, provide an environment that facilitate more accurate evaluations of the trustworthiness of political institutions. Therefore, within open societies, one would expect a positive relationship between democracy and political trust, whereas in closed societies, one would expect a negative relationship. So, in terms of past empirical findings, cross-national comparisons of the relationship between democracy and political trust across regime types are few. And these studies have had parallel findings, as I suggested. They found a negative association between democracy and trust in various political institutions. However, it should be mentioned that most of these studies are simply bivariate correlations. That is, they do not account for controls, and for the most part, they don't account for controls both at the country and individual level. These studies also do not account for potential response bias in non-democratic regimes that I had mentioned. And for the most part, these studies do not conduct a systematic comparison of political trust between partisan and non-partisan political institutions. So these are the gaps that we are attempting to address in the study that I'm presenting today. So let's talk about the concept of trust. Okay, so to what extent can the concept of trust be validly disaggregated? So the first question would be, well, is trust a general characteristic of individuals? Are individuals, is trust simply a personality of trait of individuals where a certain individual is either more or less trusting? Well, if we look at the empirical research, the empirical research suggests no, trust is not a general personality trait of individuals. And in fact, individuals make distinctions between different types of trust, social and political trust being two of those types of trusts that have been shown where individuals do make specific distinctions. So, okay, so if trust is not a general characteristic of individuals, and we can talk about political trust as distinct from other forms of trust, the next question is, well, can we validly disaggregate political trust, at least in democracies? So initial research, so the research on this is mixed, essentially. So initially, some studies that conducted factor analyses suggested that no, in fact, political trust cannot be further disaggregated, that political trust is simply a single underlying factor, and that, you know, political trust for all intents and purposes, citizens do not make large distinctions between their levels of trust in various political institutions. So that was sort of the initial research that came out looking at attempting to disaggregate political trust. However, more recent research suggests actually, yes, political trust can in fact be disaggregated if we look beyond simply the results of factor analyses, but we look at factor loadings, for instance, mean scores, hierarchical analyses of trust in political institutions, multiple group confirmatory factor analyses, and so on, that there is in fact some empirical support to disaggregate political trust. So to make a long story short, there is some support for two-dimensional conceptualization of political trust within democracies. And for this two-dimensional conceptualization, we're calling these two dimensions trust in partisan institutions and trust in non-partisan institutions. So by partisan institutions, we mean those institutions that are, as the name suggests, more partisan, such as political parties, governments, and parliaments. And by non-partisan institutions, perhaps some would be uncomfortable with that label. We could use less partisan institutions. But these institutions in democracies should at least theoretically be less partisan than what we're labeling as the partisan institutions. And these include the civil service, the police, and the courts, at least in most democracies. So what about disaggregating political trust in non-democracies? Well, here it gets a little bit trickier. So the distinction between partisan and non-partisan institutions may not be relevant to citizens in non-democratic countries. And this is because there's often less independence of non-partisan institutions in non-democratic countries. So if you have a one-party state or a strongly autocratic regime, those regimes may have full control over what we're calling non-partisan institutions, right? So therefore, there's a high likelihood of what is known as measurement non-equivalence or construct bias of these various or of trust in specific political institutions that that trust in those in particular political institutions may not mean the same thing across regime types. Okay, so this is an issue. However, we maintain that it's defensible to compare political trust across regime types with a comparative strategy that takes this into consideration. So we maintain that examining the hierarchy of levels of trust of each political institution or institutional subgroups such as partisan and non-partisan institutions provides insight into the differences in the composition of political trust between democracies and non-democracies. And this, in turn, enables us to know the manner in which this bias operates, which then assists us in drawing valid conclusions of this relationship across regime types. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of data and methods. So, of course, our dependent variable is political trust. So here we're using the standard measure of confidence in political institutions taken from the World Value Survey and European Value Study. As mentioned, we focus on 6 political institutions. So the civil service, the police, the justice system, and courts. Those 3 institutions comprise our what are the 3 institutions that make up our non-partisan index. And then trust in parliament, government, and political parties. Those 3 institutions make up our partisan index. So for democracy, we're using VDEM's Electoral Democracy Index. For control variables, we have a variety of control variables, both at the country and individual level, which you'll see on in the next few slides. But two that I want to point out here. The first is the political terror scale. So this is a country level variable, and this is what we're proposing as our potential control for response bias. So what this variable measures is the level of political violence perpetuated by the state against its citizens, including state-sanctioned killings, torture, disappearances, and political imprisonment. And it ranges from 1, which is the rule of law, to 5, pervasive terror. Okay. So while techniques attempting to control for response bias are often crude and imperfect, and this is no exception, we do contend that it is reasonable to assume that the falsification of self-reported levels of political trust due to concerns of potential reprisals would be more prevalent in countries with a higher level of political terror. Again, for the preliminary analysis that I'll be presenting today, we also look at the relationship between democracy and political trust in open versus closed societies. And here we're following Norris and using VDEM's freedom of expression and alternate sources of information index. So the methods we use are multi-level models. And once we exclude observations for which we're missing some values, we end up with a panel data set of just shy of 250,000 observations from 82 countries over a 30-year period from 1990 to 2020, with exactly 217 country years in the models. Okay, so let's get to some of the results. So what I'm showing you here is a simple bivariate scatter plot of democracy and political trust. Consistent with past research, we see the best fit line indicates a negative bivariate association between democracy and political trust. And I've sort of randomly highlighted China there to make 2 points. First, of course, China is well known as a democracy with very high levels of political trust. As a country with high levels of political trust, but a low level of democracy. But even if we exclude China from the analyses, it's not China that's driving this relationship, right? So there's a general negative association between democracy and political trust that goes beyond simply China. Again, so this is a good way to visualize the data, but if we really want a comprehensive account of this relationship, we need to look at how this relationship holds, or whether it holds under various country and individual level controls. And therefore, we turn to multi-level analyses. So here, in a nutshell, are the results of our multi-level models of political trust. So what you're looking at here are standardized or beta coefficients. So you can compare the relative magnitude of each of the covariates in the models. And we have 3 models here, right? So you can see the covariates listed on the left. The 3 models are political trust, partisan political trust, and non-partisan political trust. So to start, we created a political trust index of all 6 political institutions. So the 3 partisan institutions, the 3 non-partisan institutions, we combined them together to create an overall political trust index. And then we disaggregated that index into the partisan political trust index, which you see in the middle, and then the non-partisan political trust index, which you see on the right-hand side. So, I mean, it's hard to get specifics from this, and I'm going to present the data differently on the next slide. But the main take home here is you can see the relative, magnitude of the effect of each of the covariates in the model. And we can see clearly that democracy has the largest effect on political trust across all 3 models, and that effect is negative. But we'll take this and I'll present it in a more concrete, precise, and tabular form in this table here. So again, the same data just presented slightly differently. And what I'm presenting here are simply the covariates with the highest or the largest standardizer beta coefficients. So again, the main takeaway point here is that democracy consistently has the largest effect on political trust across all models. And this is followed by income inequality and interest in politics. So, so democracy, again, that effect is the main take-home point, but I want to focus on a couple of other findings. First is the results of the political terror scale, right? So this was our measure of response bias. So, perhaps I can say somewhat unexpectedly, but not entirely unexpectedly, the political terror scale has a significant negative relationship with political trust, rather than perhaps the positive relationship one would expect in the presence of self-censorship, right? So those respondents expressing more positive responses than would otherwise be the case in states that do not tolerate dissent, okay? However, this result is consistent with the intuitive interpretation that there is less political trust in states that terrorize its citizens. So, it could be that this variable is a poor measure of response bias, or that there is a higher frequency of respondents providing what we could call truthful or more truthful responses in states that do not tolerate expressions of dissent than anticipated. Nonetheless, we contend that the inclusion of the political terror scale does, at a minimum, provide some additional confidence in the findings. Another variable I'd like to point out is the effect of corruption. So if you look at the effect of corruption, when we put all of the institutions together in the first model, it's very minimal. But you see that when we separate institutions out, so if we look at trust and partisan institutions versus trust and non-partisan institutions, the effect is larger, but you see that the sign changes from partisan to non-partisan institutions, right? So in the full model, perhaps the effects of each are countervailing, but when we separate it out, we see a differential effect of corruption on these two institutions. So the fact that corruption has a positive effect on trust in partisan political institutions is counterintuitive. It's somewhat puzzling, and I think an interesting avenue of future research. Lastly, two individual level variables of note are interest in politics and religiosity. And notably, I find it's interesting that these are the two individual level variables that have the largest standardized coefficients, and they are larger than the standard, I'd say, demographic individual level variables such as sex, age, education, and income. Okay, so these are the bonus analyses that are not in the paper. And here we're looking at the same models, but for each model, we ran them separately for societies considered open or societies that have freedom of expression, and societies that are closed, so societies that limit freedom of expression. So again, the first two are for the combined political trust variable, and then the next two are just focused on the partisan institutions, and then the last two are focused on the non-partisan institutions. So again, these are very preliminary data, but we see that democracy is negatively related to political trust in both closed and open societies. Though it's no longer the largest effect across all models, but this is likely a function of variation because freedom of expression is highly correlated with democracy. We'll lose a lot of that variation within each of these two groups. So this diverges from Norris's findings, but again, these results are quite preliminary. They're different from Norris in the sense that we're looking at several waves of WVS and EVS data. We use a slightly different measure of democracy, and more importantly, we have a different cutoff threshold for open versus closed societies. So we use an absolute threshold of 0.5 as a score, and Norris used the mean. So that's why for ours, we have almost double the observations for open societies than we do for closed societies. So again, this is quite preliminary. I haven't had a chance to test whether we can replicate Norris's findings, but look forward to doing so in the future. But even with these preliminary results, perhaps two observations we can make here. First is that in closed societies, democracy's negative effect is stronger for partisan political trust. And this is expected, this is sort of consistent with expectations given the stronger media control over negative and control over negative messages about the government and the state, for instance. What is somewhat interesting and puzzling is that in open societies, democracy's negative effect is stronger in non-partisan political trust models. So this is the opposite of the expectation of the bifurcated trust thesis. So again, it looks like an interesting avenue for further exploration. And again, these results are quite preliminary. So by way of conclusion then, overall, the results suggest that there's a strong and robust negative relationship between democracy and political trust. And this relationship holds with a variety of country and individual level controls, including controls for potential response bias and individual trust profiles. And also the preliminary results suggest that the negative effect of democracy is consistent across both open and closed societies, although with some nuanced differences when we're looking at trust in partisan versus non-partisan political institutions. So while these results do not definitively resolve the debates of whether the negative association between democracy and political trust is problematic for democratic stability, for proponents at least of the bifurcated trust thesis, perennially low levels of political trust in non-partisan institutions, particularly those institutions that are responsible for providing public goods and enforcing the rule of law, could indicate a potential problem that may not augur well for the future of democracy. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very interesting and probably partly puzzling findings. So Christian Welzel was the first hand. Chris, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Very splendid presentation. Very much in line what I have seen in research of what you are saying. So the results are absolutely credible to me. The bigger question is about the interpretation. So I wonder, I had a PhD student, Jan Müller. Unfortunately, he left academia and did a very good dissertation on the relationship between political trust and democracy. Unfortunately, never published, but it very much goes along the lines of what you're saying. He did, however, one interesting thing, and you might look into this, because the World Value Survey has sort of 3 natural experiments. In the case of Argentina, South Korea, and Hungary. These are the 3 cases where we had a pre-regime transition survey and a post-regime transition survey, because Argentina, South Korea, Hungary were all interviewed already in the early waves in the 1980s, and then again, quickly after regime transition happened. And you can look at the political trust figures, and they dropped with the regime change. So that speaks very much to the media malaise thesis that one of the elements that lowers trust in democracies is that when you switch from an autocracy to a democracy, it means you switch from rosy propaganda to mostly investigative journalism with negative news about scandals, corruption, and everything. And that throws a shadow on people and gets them negative. So I think it could be a big confirmation of the media malaise thesis. The other thing, what I would see a little bit critical is to take the open-closed society distinction as a moderator of the democracy trust relationship, because I think it's partly tautological, because open versus closed societies is overlapping in definition with autocracy versus democracy. So I wonder, I would find it more interesting if you plug into your analysis, instead of the, I think you said it's the VDEM Electoral Democracy Index, as the main independent variable if you exchange this for different aspects of democracy. And I would like to see if freedom of press, censorship, and these kinds of things, so the media environment, are the key aspects of democracy that kind of explain that effect, or is it something else in the institutional setup? So I would like to see an analysis that kind of breaks down the democracy variable more to its more specific elements, and then to see which specific element is it that has that strongest negative effect. I would hypothesize it's indeed the censorship versus free media thing. So I wonder what you think about that.
Thank you very much.
Should I answer right away, or did you want to
Maybe we take a couple. Do we have two hands? Maybe we take two more questions. So the next one was Antonio Castaldo. Please, Antonio, your question or comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew, for the presentation. First of all, I have to say that I'm new to this field, and I'm not a quantitative guy, so please forgive me if my question will appear as trivial. So I had a look of the paper, of the article, and when I read the literature review and the hypothesis, I thought that the paper was a paper regarding the impact of political trust on democracy. But in the models, political trust is the dependent variable, and democracy is like the independent variable. All the discussion about the literature point towards the impact of political trust on democracy. The I trust thesis says that a democracy, in order to survive, has to have an high level of trust. The critical citizen thesis says that in a democracy you have to have a low level of political trust is a good thing for democracy. In all this, also in the bifurcated thesis, all this literature seems to look at the impact of political trust on democracy, but the empirical analysis is the other way around. So could you help me understand, because I'm kind of lost, and if my question is not trivial, and I had a look of several papers that were saying in a way that the literature focus on the determinants of political trust, but there is very few works that analyze the consequence of political trust. So how would you implement a sort of analysis that look at the other way around? And for example, individual level control variables, would you still keep it in the models, or would you just work on country level control variables? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Pippa, please.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I enjoyed the paper, and I read the article in Democratization earlier. My challenge is about conceptualization, and it follows on very much from Chris's observations, which is this is all about trust, but not about trustworthiness. And so, as I've been arguing recently, it's really about the relationship between what the citizens' attitudes are and the performance of institutions. And so we have issues about whether or not, and you have controls for things like corruption and so on, which are important. But essentially, as the critical citizens thesis argued 20 years ago now, if the leaders are corrupt or they're basically repressive or they have other problems, then they should not be trusted. And so for me, I like the Tom Demere's arguments about how we need to measure this through the residual analysis, where we take the difference between what citizens feel and their attitudes in surveys, how the performance indicators work, and then look at that residual and then try to explain the residuals. In other words, why do people make errors? If the government is performing well, they should be trusting. If the government's performing badly by a variety of criteria, they should not be trusting. And so that's the first conceptual question, which I think is important. And again, negative trust in a democracy that's performing poorly like the United States is actually, for me, again, a very positive, healthy sign. We should not be trusting necessarily the processes. And the second point, again, reiterates that, as Chris mentioned, there's multicollinearity issues in the models, I believe, because, again, democracy, freedom of expression are correlated at almost 0.90. So they can't be entered into the same model. And it's, again, not plausible that democracy and the way democracy works generates lack of trust, unless we're talking about questions about what media information you get. And so the freedom of information question is the more important one. And that gives us much more explanatory power than the electoral or liberal democracy batteries, which are so big and so sloppy and so broad that it's very difficult to know what's going on underneath the surface of them as well. And the disaggregated data is really where I think the interesting questions lie. So I'd love to have your response on those conceptual issues and then the empirical issues as well.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Andrew?
Okay, so thank you for the questions. I'll go in order in which they're asked. So Chris had, yeah, thank you for giving me the idea of potentially considering looking at pre and post regime transition based on the available survey data. Yeah, and so this idea of the media malaise, right? So negative news coverage may be driving this. With respect to that, I have done some analyses that substitute the democracy index for a variety of freedom of, let's say, media or freedom of expression measures. And they all seem to be they all demonstrate almost the same effect size as democracy per se. So from my initial analyses, it seems to be that freedom of expression, may be an important driver, beyond simply democracy or the machinations of democratic processes and electoral systems and so on. So I have done some of those analyses, and the preliminary results suggest that indeed freedom of the press is strongly associated to political trust, right? So open and closed societies. They are overlapping. So in the models I presented, that's why I didn't include them in the same models. I just divided for each of the dependent variables, whether it's political trust in general, trust in partisan or non-partisan institutions, I split them in terms of looking at open societies versus closed societies, and then through democracy in order to avoid the multicollinearity issues, right? So they are strongly correlated, but what that says is within, let's say, open societies, you're going to have countries that are more and less democratic. So it looks at the variation within open societies in terms of the level of democracy, and then it looks at the variation within closed societies in terms of the level of democracy. So I was trying to sort of work around the multicollinearity issues, knowing very well that not only are they highly correlated, but in fact, the freedom of expression measure is a sub-index of the democracy index that I'm using, right? So again, that's why the results are preliminary. There'd have to be other study, further refinement of the empirical results to tease that relationship out. But again, I just wanted to present some preliminary findings to provoke some discussion, which it looks like it was successful in doing. To Antonio's questions, so these are good questions. So in terms of the causal direction, right? So I was looking at democracy as an independent variable and political trust as a dependent variable. But I was sort of flirting with the idea that it could be the other way around, sort of, in the sense that this is sort of done, although I'm not speaking directly to democratic decline, this was sort of done with the intention of looking at the relationship of political trust and potentially democratic stability, right? So just by that nature, I'm sort of flipping the causal direction around here. However, if we look, so sure, to what extent would political trust be an explanatory variable explaining regime change, right? So that's an interesting question. My sense is it's going to be less powerful explanatory variable of regime change than democracy is of political trust. But that would require a whole separate analysis, including a variety of different variables that would explain, regime change, and then throwing in political trust, presumably political trust, perhaps of the year or some sort of aggregate average of 5 years earlier, and looking at that result, right? And in fact, then you'd have to ask the question, well, if democracies have low political trust, what would that look like, right? Regime change in which direction? Regime change from autocracy to democracy or democracy to autocracy? So that, I think it's a very valid point that you're making, but that would, to look at it the other way properly, that would imply sort of a separate analysis. But I take your point there that I perhaps was incautiously flirting with the causal direction, particularly when I'm looking at, framing it in the idea of whether political trust may, or low levels of political trust, is it in fact related to democratic instability? And for Pippa's comments about trust and trustworthiness. So you're absolutely right. So I did this by design. So for this particular paper, I was focused specifically on trust, and I wanted to sort of put a pin in the idea of, well, what makes one trust more or less, right? So I was kind of conveniently avoiding the ideas of what are the factors that may influence trust, although I did include some control variables, corruption, and so on, that could arguably be associated with trust, right? So I did, add those particular controls, but for this project, I was bracketing it, and I just wanted to see, I was really focused on the relationship between political trust and democracy without looking at necessarily the causes of political trust, which I was kind of bracketing as potentially a separate study. And I think I really like the idea of looking at residuals in terms of looking at differences between, let's say, attitudes, and we can call it performance, or we can call it looking at differences between attitudes and whatever other variables that we think may be influencing people's levels of trust, and then trying to tease out what's going on there. So I think that's a very promising methodological approach to trying to, when one is interested in explaining why people have particular attitudes, such as what, I think one of the objectives of TRUEDEM is, I do think that's a very promising approach. And again, yeah, I spoke to the multicollinearity issues of the freedom of expression. And again, disaggregating democracy, looking at various measures of limits on media, limits on freedom of expression is highly correlated and negatively correlated to political trust.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We have one question from Goff Holloway. It's written in chat, but maybe Goff, you would like to say it.
Yes, my general question is, to what extent is political trust a consequence of the broader issue of social cohesion? Now, I'm taking Australia as an example, and over the past 16 years, the Scanlon Foundation has done comprehensive surveys of social cohesion, and presently it's the lowest it's ever been over the past 16 years. So I'm wondering whether political trust is related to broader issues. And of course, social cohesion can be made up of a whole lot of variables, including mental health and a whole lot of other things. In fact, there's about 10 variables I can think of. Any comment would be appreciated.
Thank you very much, Goff. Chris, do you have more questions?
Yeah, I have one more. Because it relates back to what Pepa just said with the residual approach. I think the first guys who applied it was Stefan Kruse, Maria Ravlik, and me in a paper in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, but a different variable, but very related. So what we looked at is in the World Values Survey, we have this question where we ask people on a 10-point scale, how democratic is your country? 1 means absolutely not, 10 means perfectly democratic. And then related this question to what the real degree of democracy is. So, and we exchange Freedom House of Polity and VDEM, Liberal Democracy Index. So you get residuals. So people overestimate and others underestimate. So overrating versus underrating. And for us, the one of the key questions, of course, was this this problem. Sure, there is a media malaise thesis that has some evidence to it, as I said before, in the 3 cases where we have a natural experiment, survey before and survey after the regime transition, and immediately after transition to democracy, trust levels drop considerably in all 3 countries. But we do not know exactly what the mechanism is. So did people lie before and then get to their true levels, or was the opinion, the positive opinion to the regime that they expressed before, was that the truth? So I think we have to do more on finding out what this, how we can resolve this problem when we do surveys in autocracies, this public lies, private truths. One thing we did was to look into the percentage of missing values that you get, so response refusal, because we thought if it is true that many people in an autocratic country report much more trust than they really have, these people would be thrown, however, in an interview situation in a classic Leon Festinger cognitive dissonance situation. And we know from psychological research that people try to avoid cognitive dissonance. And what should happen is that people then refuse. So you should have systematically higher response refusal on a degree of higher autocracy. We didn't find this to be the case, but I think this is one lead we could follow in further research and think about more ideas, how we can figure out whether the answers of the people are really truthful, what they really think, or are just really this falling into this trap of Timur Kuran's public truth, private lies problem. Sorry, the opposite, public lies, private truths.
Thank you very much, Chris. So Andrew, we have 2 questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So to Jeff's question, so political trust and social cohesion. So when you first said social cohesion, I was thinking of social trust as someone who researches both. You know, that relationship is complicated. They are considered 2 different things. And you know, some societies, you'll see high social trust, low political trust. And some societies, you see the reverse. In some societies, they're much more correlated. And of course, those are averages. It depends on the individual, right? But then political trust and, say, other broader indicators such as mental health and so on, that there is some research, pioneering research, looking into links between political trust and health. And I've seen sort of different views in terms of how low health can result in low political trust and low participation, but low or poor health, I should say, could also result in higher rates of participation and either higher or low levels of political trust, depending on certain contextual factors. So there is some research looking at these types of connections, but from my sense, it depends on the variable, right? If you're focused on mental health, and are you focused on political trust, are you focused on political participation, etc., right? So it's very variable and context specific from what I could see. And to Chris's point, so two things. One thing I forgot to address was the drop in trust during transitions, right? So I think, that may provide some evidence of the media malaise argument, but also one could arguably, or make the argument that essentially in any transition, regime transitions, one way or the other, these things tend to be messy, and therefore we might expect a temporary drop in trust one way or the other, right? So this is an empirical question. One could test that question. And others have written about during transitions a honeymoon period, and then after that goes away, and then there may be a further dip after the honeymoon period. So at any rate, transitions I think are really interesting to examine. But my sense on transitions is I would like to look at the change during, just after the transition, and then whether that change in political trust is maintained over time, or whether that gradually changes over time, right? And that's an empirical question that, at least with a few cases, I think we can get at with the data. I don't know.
Just to interrupt very briefly, my PhD student figured it out. It is not like a dip and then it goes back. After transition to democracy, there is a drop, and it never turns back to the previous level. Actually, it goes slightly down in most of those cases, even further, but slightly. The slope is very slight, but there is a big drop after regime transition from autocracy to democracy. The other way around, I haven't seen such a natural experiment, but that would be interesting. It should go up then in the opposite logic, but I haven't seen any of that.
Right. Well, that's very interesting then, and that does provide more support for the media malaise hypothesis. And yeah, thank you for the reference. I'm actually working on in terms of looking at how respondents think, or the extent to which respondents think their country is democratic versus how democratic the country is. I'm currently working on some research that does just that. So thank you for the reference, and I do think that that's quite interesting and looking and powerful in terms of potentially conducting a variety of analyses related to political trust, and grouping people in terms of those who, let's say, can somewhat accurately predict their country's level of democracy versus those who cannot, right? And how that may lead to different types of changes in various indicators of trust and other indicators. So I do think that is a fruitful line of research. And I also agree that the missing values data that we often ignore could also be very fruitful, but it sounds like you guys have already explored that as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So we are finishing perfectly on time. If there are any more questions, please email Andrew or ask questions on social media. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please follow our updates for the next webinars. One will be at the end of June with Daniel Devine, and the next one will be then in early September. So thanks to everyone, and have a good afternoon, evening.